B-17 flying fortress Pardis. On Valentine's Day 1944, a crew of 10 US airmen took off in a Boeing B-17G flying fortress nicknamed Pardis to bomb some rail yards in Verona, Italy. They struggled to locate the target due to severe fog. The 4-engine heavy bomber was struck by enemy fire multiple times while flying over the target area, causing its tail guns to jam and 2 of its engines to burst into flames. After realizing that the plane was struggling from the outlines of its formation and in a severely disadvantaged position, the enemy fire only continued. Even after the aircraft began to fail, its crew fought fearlessly against the enemy, shooting down several planes in the process. Unfortunately, they failed to reach the runway where they planned to make an emergency landing. After learning that the B-17 was too heavy for the runway, the crew began dumping as much extra weight as they possibly could. While they were doing so, a 3rd engine exploded, giving the pilot no choice but to ditch the bomber into the sea, roughly 300 feet off the coast of Calvi, France. By then, 3 crew members had been killed in combat and went down with the plane. Another crew member was seriously wounded, while 2 other men sustained light injuries. Luckily for the surviving airmen, the aircraft floated long enough for them to escape and board life rafts. Today, the Pardis remains at the bottom of the sea. Its wings are mostly intact and the engines are visible, despite the damage they incurred when the aircraft was shot down. The cockpit's also in surprisingly good condition and still contains its 2 metal seats and most of its instrumentation. Most of the propeller blades have been removed, and the plane's nose was destroyed upon impact. 8. Omis Military Base. The infamous Eastern Bloc Treaty known as the Warsaw Pact was officially disbanded toward the end of the Cold War in 1991, 36 years after it went into effect. By then, many of its signatory countries had already started to downsize their militaries. Included among them was Czechoslovakia, which continually reduced the size of its army from 1989 until 1993, when the country separated into modern-day Slovakia and the Czech Republic. At its peak, the Czechoslovak People's Army had 200,000 members, which was an extraordinarily high number for a country of just 15 million people. Consequently, a lot of bases were abandoned during the downsizing period that came during the fall of the Iron Curtain. One of these former military sites, located in the Czech village of Omis, is home to a multitude of deserted vehicles that are in surprisingly good shape for their age. Footage captured by an urban explorer who goes by the YouTube handle Survival Fox shows at least 2 Soviet-made UAZ-452 vans. Designed in the late 1960s, the model is reportedly still being used by the Russian military today. The video includes a Tatra 805 military truck, which was widely used by the Czechoslovak People's Army, as well as a late 1950s BRDM-2 armored vehicle, which Russia's been using in its Ukraine invasion. It's telling to realize that while these Soviet-era relics represent a step back in time to the Cold War, which was marked by a distinct lack of physical combat, they're also an active fixture of modern warfare. 7. The Malberg Barn. Located in western Germany, roughly halfway between Frankfurt and Cologne, the town of Bad Ems is home to around 9,000 residents. Since the 1870s, its economy's been largely based on tourism as a spa resort destination. The town's also famous for its abandoned funicular, known as the Malberg Barn. Built in the late 19th century, the cable railway was implemented as a way for visitors to reach a mountaintop hotel. It was the only easy way for people to get to the hotel. The funicular transported its riders 1,148 feet from the bottom of the hill to the property. Running along a 54.5% incline, it was considered Germany's steepest vehicle of its kind. Like most funiculars, the Malberg Barn traveled at a pace that could be most politely described as leisurely, peaking at 4.3 miles per hour, until a 1963 upgrade brought up its maximum speed to 7.4 miles per hour. Also, like most funiculars, the system worked by counterbalancing 2 vehicles that ran in opposite directions. To keep it running smoothly, its operators at the top loaded up the passengers and added water to a special compartment to bring the car to a specific weight. Gravity did the rest of the work, pulling the top carriage downhill and pulling the bottom vehicle up. The funicular fell into decline in 1951 after the 25-year leasing contract with the mountaintop hotel expired. Ownership was passed along to the city, which unfortunately couldn't afford to keep the system running safely. It was closed permanently in 1979. Today, the carriages remain at the stations, and the site is considered an official monument despite its neglected state. Would you like to visit this abandoned site? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. Train caboose in the Canadian woods. Perched oddly on a hill in an unspecified part of the Canadian woods, which means it could be almost anywhere in Canada, there's a faded red 1940s era train caboose that looks like it randomly plopped down out of the sky one day with no rhyme or reason for where it ended up. In a YouTube video published by Abandoned Urbex Canada in early 2022, the host explains that the caboose has been at its current location since the 1980s. It was a birthday gift from the former property owner's sons, who spent $20,000 on the caboose to give their father what any rail enthusiast would consider the surprise of a lifetime. To get the caboose to its current location, the sons had a custom track built at the site. Using 2 large hired cranes, they lifted the train car and set it in place. As the Abandoned Urbex Canada video points out, they probably also had to cut down trees to create a clearing for the caboose. Over the last 30 to 40 years since, it appears as though nature has started to reclaim the site. The landowner's home was demolished after he passed away in 2004, but the train remains at the property to this day. In fact, that's where his ashes are scattered. The car is in surprisingly good condition for its age, although its interior furnishings are sparse to say the least. Actually, the car appears mostly empty, minus some seating, counter space, and cabinetry that remains affixed to the floor and walls. 5. Tanks in Antarctica. For a 3-year period starting in 1939, the US Navy, State Department, Treasury, and Department of the Interior jointly sponsored the United States Antarctic Service Expedition. Led by the famed explorer Admiral Richard Byrd, a team of 59 researchers stayed at 2 separate bases, known simply as East and West. Their equipment, which was transported to Antarctica by ship, included the only tanks to ever serve on the continent. As it turned out, tanks were a bad choice for the Antarctic terrain and climate. They were too heavy to operate effectively on the snowy ground and experienced a handful of mechanical complications, including water leaking into the gas tanks and frozen air filters in the engines. Today, the rusting vehicles remain at the site where they were abandoned. Reports vary regarding how many tanks there are, with some claiming that there are 2, while others note that there are 3. There are also conflicting accounts detailing the makes and models of the tanks. All reports seem to agree that at least one of the vehicles is an American-built M2A2 light tank, which debuted in the 1930s and saw limited use in World War II. The tanks were left behind along with a large amount of other equipment in 1941, when the expedition was abruptly ended due to rising international tensions. 4. Desna River tram. Along a quiet tributary of the Desna River in Ukraine's Kyiv region, there's a dilapidated floating tram covered in chipped red and yellow paint. Perched on a pair of moss-covered pontoons, the conspicuously out-of-place cable car is rumored to belong to a former chief of waterways who bought it as a dasher or vacation home. According to the travel blog Ukraine Trek, the owner found it much easier to buy a structure that was already assembled rather than build his home away from home from scratch. The interior of the car consisted of cabins with beds and a kitchen with a fully functioning refrigerator. It had no engine, but this wasn't a problem. At the time, the Desna River saw a lot of traffic, and passing boats were happy to let the bizarre contraption hitch a ride. One look at the unconventional vehicle is all it takes to realize that it's been abandoned for many years. Photos captured by blogger and photographer Richard Zorge in 2015 show that the inside is in no better shape. Even the least outdoorsy person would likely favor a tent in the woods and a complete lack of modern conveniences over the filthy debris-covered mattresses that look only slightly newer than everything else around them. Sources on the floating tram are scarce and haven't been updated in several years, so there's a good chance that it no longer even exists. If it does, it's probably not only an eyesore, but a safety hazard not worth exploring, although its former owner does deserve some points for creativity. Would you ever repurpose an old train car as a home? Let me know in the comments below, but hit that subscribe button first. 3. The Alpine Funicular Railway. From the early 1900s to the late 1970s, the Alpine Funicular Railway in northern Italy transported tourists between an idyllic lakeshore and a nearby mountaintop, which was home to a variety of restaurants, hotels, and other attractions. At its peak, the railway transported as many as 30,000 people up the mountain every year. It functioned like most other funiculars, with two cars that counterbalance one another on a cable-based system. Each vehicle was permanently attached to one end of the cable, and the two moved in a synchronized fashion. One car ascended while the opposite vehicle went down the mountain, with the latter providing the bulk of the much-needed energy for the former to travel uphill. Today, the defunct funicular stations are eerily silent. A series of photos published by Obsidian Urbex Photography in late 2018 show an aging light blue wooden tram parked on an overgrown track in the upper station, where it's reportedly been sitting for upwards of 3 decades. According to the website, a group of dedicated locals hopes to reopen the funicular someday, but the project has yet to come to fruition due to the high costs of restoring the vehicle to its former glory. 2. Soviet training tank in the German forest. Nicknamed Little Moscow and the Forbidden City, Wunsdorf is a 60,000-acre former military camp that once served as the Red Army's German headquarters. It was home to 75,000 people, including 40,000 Soviet soldiers and their families. The last remaining Russian troops fled the complex in 1994, a few years after the Iron Curtain fell. Given just 12 hours' notice, they left in a hurry, with some even leaving behind their pets and half-eaten lunches. Today, much of Wunsdorf remains intact, albeit in a state of decay. Outside the deserted city in the middle of the forest, there's a rusting contraption that looks like a tank from a distance. Up close, it becomes apparent that the oddly shaped vehicle has no wheels. Even in its decaying state, it's clear that it was never a fully functioning tank. Unlike dummy tanks, which were made from wood and rubber and were meant to deceive the enemy, the bizarre machine is made of metal. It lacks any bullet holes or other signs that it may have been used for target practice. But it does closely resemble a similar tank that was found at another hidden Soviet base in Germany, known as Vogelsang, which was used for training purposes. Known as an Übungspanzer, it appears to be at least somewhat modeled after a Soviet T-54 tank. There's not much left of its interior, but based on appearances, it was once equipped with 2 seats and instruments for loading and aiming the turret. Little is officially known about the practice tank, including how long it's been there, but there's a good chance that it's been rusting away since long before Wunsdorf's abandonment. 1. Vintage Paris subway cars. As recently as 2015, a handful of decaying graffiti-covered vintage subway cars sat mostly undisturbed on a storage track in Paris, save for the occasional urban explorer or spray painter. Located next to the Villiers metro station, the track was formerly used as a roundabout for the city's Metro Line 3 before it was extended years ago. It's clear, based on photos captured by Untapped Cities writer Melanie de Groot van Emden, that the cars were in an advanced state of decay when the pictures were taken. If they're still around and not being cared for, they're presumably in much worse shape by now. Just the same, seeing the old subways would be a rare treat for any train history enthusiast, regardless of their condition. Sadly, like most rapid transit relics, most of the cars were slated for demolition, with the slight possibility that a few were set aside to be restored and preserved. Those that were lucky enough to be saved would eventually be destined for a preservation warehouse in the commune of Villeneuve, which houses a jaw-dropping collection of strikingly pristine vintage metro cars, trolleys and buses. With vehicles dating as far back as the 1930s, the garage is a subway fanatic's paradise. Unfortunately, it's not open to the public, but once in a blue moon the city runs some of these nostalgia cars, giving everyday commuters the rare opportunity to step back in time and experience the ride as people would have in decades past. 9. Mi-6 helicopter. During an oil prospecting expedition in 1981, a Soviet-built Mi-6 helicopter stopped to refuel at the Kalampur base in Russia's Yamalo-Nenets region, which is located roughly 1,500 miles outside Moscow. 5 miles after the chopper took off, both of its engines failed, forcing its pilot to crash land the aircraft in a swamp. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but the helicopter was severely damaged and was no longer deemed airworthy. An investigation revealed that workers mistakenly filled the fuel tanks with a mixture of gas and water. More than 40 years later, the wreck remains in the swamp and there appear to be no plans to remove it. First built in 1959, the MiL Mi-6 heavy transport helicopter was designed for both military and civilian use. It was the largest helicopter in production until it was superseded by the MiL Mi-26 in 1980. Measuring 109 feet long from nose to tail, the colossal Mi-6 is normally flown by a crew of 5 or more individuals. It has enough room for 65 troops, 41 patients on stretchers, and heavy vehicles and weapons. Over 900 of the choppers were built before the Russian military retired the model in 2002, and many countries continue to use it today. 8. Pardis City. Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's idea of affordable housing may have been well-intentioned, but it was also ill-conceived. Inconveniently located 31 miles outside Tehran, on a barren, desolate stretch of land, Pardis City is made up of dozens of drab, identical apartment blocks in various stages of construction. It's not completely empty, but it's pretty close. Out of the city's 74,000 planned units, the vast majority are uninhabited. The completed parts of the project have drawn both low-income families and middle-class tenants who wanted to get away from the city. With the country's economy in shambles, the units aren't as affordable as they were meant to be. But that's just one of several reasons why people don't seem to want to live here. Satellite images captured in 2019 show a distinct lack of cars and people at Pardis City, indicating that the troubled development is still failing to attract many newcomers years after the first apartments became available. At some point, construction ground to a halt, and it showed no signs of resuming, leaving the site littered with incomplete buildings. Iranian leadership has gone back and forth on whether it would be best to see the project through or cut its losses and end the flow of money that's already gone into the self-defeating development. 7. Al Madam. Less than an hour outside the bustling city of Dubai, a handful of neatly arranged houses and an elegant mosque sit near a quiet intersection, half consumed by shifting sand dunes. Known as Al Madam, the deserted village has attracted a growing number of curious visitors in recent years. Nobody seems to know for certain why the settlement was abandoned. With some doors left open and others missing, urban explorers are free to look around. It almost seems like everyone left in a hurry on short notice, without even bothering to lock their doors on the way out. And yet, there are no signs of destruction or any other major problems. Some locals who live in neighboring towns have reportedly blamed violent sandstorms for Al Madam's desertion. There are also rumors of supernatural forces scaring residents away. Another possible explanation lies within a concept called Shabi housing, according to Columbia University architecture professor Yasser Eshetowi, who told CNN that the building style first surfaced during the late 1960s as part of the government's attempts to settle nomadic Bedouin tribes. It was part of a modernization scheme born from the misguided belief that a traditional lifestyle reflects poverty and hardship. After the United Arab Emirates became a country in 1971, authorities really began to push people to live in permanent dwellings. But some Shabi complexes were built in such a hurry that they weren't properly equipped with running water and electricity. While conducting research, El-Shatori learned that many people spent months living in these settlements without access to modern conveniences. So they left, and this could be why Al Madam was abandoned. But at least for now, the mystery continues. 6. Thames Town. We're sure you've heard of Jamestown, but what about Thames Town? In 2001, Beijing city planners came up with an experimental response to the growing problem of overcrowding to build imitation European towns on the outskirts in hopes of luring city dwellers to the suburbs. Dubbed One City, Nine Towns, the project called for 9 communities, each with a design based on a different country. The planned settlements included Scandinavian, Italian, Spanish, Canadian, Dutch, German, and English towns. Some of the towns have attracted a decent amount of new residents, while others have been less successful. The British-inspired Thames Town looks so authentic that it seems like it was plucked right out of the United Kingdom. In fact, it might be easy for someone to forget they're in China while exploring the large community. But Thames Town is much different from Britain in one major way. It's largely empty, despite being completed in 2006, giving it the eerie feel of a ghost town. It was built to house a population of 10,000, but it's also an upscale town. Many people can't afford to live there, and those who can usually treat their property in Thames Town as a second home. They don't live there full time, and even if they did, the town wouldn't be anywhere near full. Even most of the restaurants and storefronts are unoccupied, which will do no favors for attracting new residents. After all, what good is a lovely neighborhood if you can't even find somewhere to grab a bite to eat? Would you ever consider moving to a completely abandoned town? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, subscribe. 5. Drawbridge. Situated on the soft, marshy ground of a tiny island in San Francisco Bay, a collection of dilapidated and overgrown wooden structures seem to be sinking into the earth. There's a handful of cabins that clearly haven't been lived in for many years, along with the remnants of a train station and a railroad track. People who are old enough to remember the ghost town, known as Drawbridge, have described 2 starkly contrasting versions of it. Some say it was a popular party destination, where people went to let loose after dealing with the responsibilities of adulthood all week. Others recall Drawbridge as a calm and peaceful place, where nature enthusiasts retreated to escape the hustle and bustle of life on the mainland. Founded in 1876, the town initially consisted of a single cabin that housed a railway employee who was tasked with operating 2 nearby drawbridges. As people began to recognize the island's recreational value, they built vacation homes and hunting lodges. By the 1880s, as many as 1,000 people flocked to the drawbridge on the weekends. At its height, the town consisted of around 90 buildings and was home to 2 neighborhoods, one predominantly Roman Catholic, the other mostly Protestant. But the thrill of being there apparently wore off, and the town was slowly abandoned until the last resident cleared out in 1979. Since then, the terrain's become a marshland, and it's unsafe to visit the remaining buildings. Drawbridge is considered the Bay Area's only ghost town, and is now part of the Donnellwood San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. 4. Sinai Hotels. Dozens of abandoned hotels line a 120-mile stretch of road along the southeastern coast of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. These dystopian concrete structures range in style from futuristic to geometric. They consist of staircases to nowhere, empty swimming pools, and colossal entrances that more closely resemble post-Soviet runs than the architecture of up-and-coming business ventures. They're the product of a construction boom spanning multiple decades, which began after developers and government realized that tourists are attracted to the peninsula's pristine beaches. The construction projects were abruptly abandoned at various points in time and in different states of completion. During the early 2000s, a series of bombings at resorts struck a hard blow to the region's tourism industry. Visitor numbers were up again in 2011, but the Egyptian revolution and a spate of ensuing violence once again caused people to stay away. As of 2018, tourism was starting to pick up again, but it seems unlikely that the unfinished hotels and resorts that dot the coastline will ever be finished. And while it's hard not to notice the potential in the towering grey skeletons of buildings that were left behind, they've been there for so long that they've almost become a seemingly natural part of the landscape. 3. Borovsko Bridge. A curious concrete eyesore in the Czech Republic's Benesov district protrudes out from a densely wooded forest and extends into the Sedlicky River, where it abruptly stops without reaching the other side. Known as the Borovsko Bridge, it's an unfinished roadway that Adolf Hitler envisioned as part of a far-reaching highway network that would connect every corner of the Third Reich. Measuring 72 feet wide, The oversized bridge wasn't only meant as a means of getting from one place to another, it was a display of dominance. Construction on the Borovsko Bridge began in 1939. At the time, the Sedlicky River's water level was much lower than it is now, after being filled up as part of a man-made reservoir. When it could be seen in its entirety, the bridge stood at an impressive 328 feet high. Today, however, the road surface sits just feet above the water. To meet its planned deadline, the project called for around 800 laborers. But staffing shortages left construction in the hands of an understaffed 150-member crew. Cement and other materials were also in short supply, yet the work on the bridge continued. After Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, most of Czechoslovakia's infrastructure projects were cancelled. The cement that was being used for the bridge was now needed for the creation of defense fortifications. Construction continued at a majorly slowed pace until the Czechoslovakian resistance assassinated Hitler's right-hand man Reinhard Heydrich, the appointed Nazi governor of the Czech Republic in 1942. The project resumed under the newly installed communist leadership after the war, but the bridge was ultimately abandoned after authorities decided to create a reservoir and flood most of it. 2. Soviet Cultural Center in the Woods. Located in modern-day Armenia, the spa town of Yermak was a popular Soviet-era vacation destination. During its heyday, as many as 4 small planes passed through its airport daily to drop off and pick up tourists. As the Soviet Union's collapse approached during the late 1980s, visitor numbers dropped dramatically. The airport closed, and the population dropped to less than half of what it was at its peak. Since then, Yermak has seen a resurgence, and its future is promising. But times have changed, and not everything that once existed there can be restored to its former glory. Take, for example, the Palace of Culture, an imposing building that sits along the south shore of Sarnik Biar Lake. But it looks more like it belongs in the middle of a city. Construction on the center began in 1969, but wasn't completed until 1986. Inside, the floor is littered with debris, staircases are crumbling, and the once grand atrium and auditorium are completely dilapidated. Once home to a rooftop pool that served as a popular gathering spot, it lacks any sign of life today. Soviet relics can still be found inside, including sculptures, artwork, empty soda bottles, and even a foosball table. It's as if life was totally normal one day and took an unexpected turn the next, leaving the building forgotten on what seems like a moment's notice. An Armenian businessman reportedly bought the property with plans to restore it, but never got around to doing so. At this point, it's in such bad shape that it may not even be restorable. Yermak is home to various other fascinating examples of Soviet architecture, some of which aren't abandoned and are used today as spas and gyms. There's also a towering, classically Soviet-style monument commemorating the 50th anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution, which was installed in 1967. 1. Stasi Hotel. Similar to the KGB, the Stasi was East Germany's secret police force. It was notorious for breeding terror and distrust among the populace, leaving civilians unsure of who to trust and afraid to utter even a word that could be taken as a betrayal against the state. And while the average person was supposed to be happy with the life that the government chose for them and never dare complain, top-ranking cops and the political elite shamelessly indulged in the finer things in life. East Germany destroyed the vast majority of its records before the country reunified at the end of the Cold War. But some things were left behind, offering clues about what life in the highly secretive state was like. Tucked away in a remote forest in the town of Templin, far from the prying eyes of the common folk, an unfinished hotel called the MFS Buchheim would have functioned as a retreat for Stasi officers and their families. Construction on the 4-story structure began during the 1980s. Had the building been completed, it would have housed a restaurant, a wellness center, a sauna, a bowling alley, a pool, and 180 rooms. The hotel was slated to open in 1991, but the fall of the Iron Curtain cut these plans short, and the partially built structure remains hidden in the forest today. As dilapidated as the building is, it's easy to tell based on the large picture windows, floor-to-ceiling sliding doors, balconies, and other features that the hotel would have cut no corners when it came to quality. Unfortunately, more specific details about the property are scarce. Today, the graffiti-covered site attracts bored troublemakers and urban explorers who are eager to gain a first-hand look at an era and a place they never experienced themselves. Would you rather find a rare plane in the middle of nowhere that you can sell for $1 million, or an abandoned estate that's fully self-sufficient that you can live in without paying any bills? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye guys!